Welcome to my TOK oral presentation. I'm first going to introduce what the origins of my presentation were and what real-life situation I based my oral off. So I was watching a TED Talk, which is a presentation online, and it was about grit and how it determines success academically and in school, and furthermore in daily life. Now this is interesting because knowledge and understanding directly linked to education, and they are the foundational ideas which are embedded in it. And from this real-life situation, I had a thought process, and I formulated these questions based off this situation. So I watched the talk, and it brought me to the topic of success in academic endeavours and what this entails. And I formulated the question: is academic success determined by having knowledge, or rather by understanding? So is it about knowing facts, or is it about having a comprehension of the idea? And the last subsequent question I came up with is, how does knowledge translate into understanding? Which is an interesting idea which I'll explore in this presentation. The knowledge question which I'm exploring is, does having more knowledge mean that one has a better understanding? And this directly links to education, because these ideas of knowledge and understanding are what we as a student go through in everyday life, because we have to constantly translate knowledge into an understanding which we can express in exams and tests. So I first will define the terms which I've used in the question, because they're rather broad, and I want to explain what I'm implying by having them in my question. And I essentially want to say, what do they mean in the context of my approach to this analysis? So having more knowledge. Well, knowledge can't necessarily be measured because it is an idea, a concept that one has. One cannot say that a person has more knowledge than another, specifically. This is because it is extremely difficult to compare the amount of knowledge one has to another. However, I'm looking at it in terms of specific cases where different knowledge focus may lead to a different understanding. I'm going to examine knowledge quantitatively, that is the amount of knowledge that one has, or qualitatively, knowledge which is based on some quality and cannot be measured numerically. There are limits to both and also benefits to both types of knowledge. And in terms of the translation to understanding, this is because certain types of knowledge are more useful to different forms of understanding. And by better understanding, I'm viewing this as a gaining of a more sophisticated comprehension of this specific area of knowledge. This is to have more comprehension of the concept. I have to define this because one can have understanding in different ways. This will be demonstrated in the scenarios which I'm going to analyse. Here are some further questions which are centrally relevant knowledge issues which relate to the question. So back to the idea of, can knowledge be measured quantitatively, and how do different forms of knowledge translate into understanding? Furthermore, does knowledge and the subsequent potential understanding formed from it function conjunctively? In that sense, does knowledge always imply a subsequent understanding? Also, does a vast amount of knowledge offer more value to one's understanding than a smaller focus of knowledge, which is a foundational idea behind this knowledge question? So I'm going to go more into these ideas and how they relate to my question and my real-life situation. So I'm going to look at these relevant areas of knowledge, and they all relate to education, which is the real-life situation. So in biology at school, we examine different cells under a microscope. This qualitative knowledge can be used to form an understanding of the topic. Here, I use my sense perception as a way of knowing to gain more knowledge about cells. However, this narrow focus perhaps gives a different perspective than if I were to examine a large amount of knowledge. The idea of the microscope and the telescope is largely relevant here. They both have a different scope of knowledge, perhaps presenting it with either a broad view with little detail, or a microscopic view with great detail but lacks knowledge about the bigger picture. What is the implication of this? Well, each scope of knowledge here was different, and they can both potentially lead to different understandings of what is occurring. Therefore, even if one has a broad view of the knowledge area, perhaps that doesn't imply that that understanding is better, and the same for the other situation. This implies that knowing more doesn't necessarily mean that one has better understanding, but perhaps a different perspective on the subject of inquiry. Another implication is that knowledge of some functioning part of the world, such as a cell, gives in-depth understanding, but does not necessarily give insight to how the greater context functions. And one may have to look to other scopes of knowledge to gain this understanding. And this relates back to education, because we have to assess a wide variety of knowledge and the scope of it in our studies. So, if one wants to form a holistic understanding of a subject of inquiry, perhaps it is therefore necessary to focus on multiple perspectives. The next idea I'm looking at is statistics, which we obviously study at school in mathematics. The usage of statistics is prevalent throughout the world, and one can gain an understanding from them. However, as seen previously, it depends on the scope of knowledge as to what understanding is formed. At Prince Alfred, Mrs. Wilson collects a wide range of statistics of students to help the needs of those students, but does having a wide range of data on us necessarily aid in achieving that purpose? In this case, reason and logic is used to fit the needs of students according to statistics, but perhaps having a more narrow range of statistics would assist in creating a better understanding of the student themselves. Huge amount of data, while it may attempt to suit our needs, it may not necessarily, because massive amounts of statistics and data doesn't necessarily mean that the school understands us better and how to suit our needs. Perhaps does it help us to understand our needs better? But that is open to question, because perhaps it doesn't necessarily. Perhaps it is more useful to focus on the specific parts of our life, and one can use reason to argue that having a more narrow focus of these statistics would give a different insight into our lives. This implies that the scope of knowledge can often determine what the understanding is. Therefore, in your own studies, if you have a particular scope of knowledge, it will direct you along a certain path. My next situation is directly related to personal knowledge, and I came to this idea when I watched a film called Dead Man Walking, in which a murderer on death row is being counselled by a nun. A criminal profiler, in this case, would have a lot of knowledge about the criminal, but that wouldn't necessarily translate into an understanding of him as a person or why he has committed these crimes. This is because his knowledge is largely in details, in statistical data of events and his past, gained through reason, and thus he would more likely have a merely sterile understanding of the subject, and this would inhibit his understanding of the person. Whereas the nun, who has less knowledge in terms of his past, which is largely unknown to her, she gains personal knowledge of the criminal through emotion, language, and faith, which would otherwise be highly unlikely to be attainable. This translates into a deeper understanding on her part of the murderer, and therefore able to form further understanding in an emotional sense. However, it is still evident that in these two views, they have different types of knowledge about the criminal, which forms their own understanding. Thus, the case shows that knowledge will always be a present use to us, however, it won't necessarily translate into understanding, because a criminal profile may have more knowledge, yet he was inhibited by it in the formation of an understanding about this criminal. Furthermore, an implication of this is that having an understanding isn't necessarily proportional to knowing the details, but rather it means a comprehension of the overall picture of the specific knowledge area looked into. And this has application in daily lives, because you may look at a certain situation, but if you don't have an understanding of the whole picture, you can't really know what's going on, even if you know all of the facts. And subsequently, what are the outcomes of these situations, and how does it relate back to the real life situation and the knowledge question? Well, as in these cases was observed, perhaps having more knowledge doesn't necessarily indicate a better understanding, but perhaps it is the form of knowledge, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, and the scope of the knowledge, which indicates what the understanding entails, and if any understanding will be formed on such a basis. Therefore, knowledge is useful to us, but perhaps it doesn't necessarily translate into understanding in every case. And perhaps my PowerPoint becomes a critique of contemporary education, because what are we truly prioritizing when we're learning? We can gain as much knowledge as possible, but does that truly benefit our understanding and how we apply that in our studies? Perhaps it isn't. We should focus less on information and the collection of facts, but perhaps more on the understanding of what that is and the specific understanding gained from the different viewpoints that we look into. I want to make the point that perhaps the awareness of the scope of knowledge...